And welcome to my first podcast. My name is Anaya, and today in this podcast, we're going to be talking about civil disobedience. So, what is civil disobedience? I think is the first thing we should talk about. Civil disobedience, according to Google, is the refusal to comply with certain laws or to pay taxes and fines as a peaceful form of political protest. To me, that means pretty much civil disobedience is going against things that are put in line for you, rules and things that are put in line for you to follow, and going against those things as a way to fight for what you need to be changed 9 times out of 10 for the better. So why did I choose this topic to talk about? For one, I chose to talk about because, obviously for school purposes, but also because when we first started talking about this, it was really interesting to me. It was automatically something I was drawn into because I know it was something that, obviously, I've heard about like civil rights movements and things in the past, but I never actually researched or been educated on this topic. And now that I am, I'm very glad I am because it opened my eyes to a lot of different things. And it also helped me understand like why many of the things that have happened in our past and many of the things that are the way they are today are because of civil disobedience. So, the question for this podcast is civil disobedience an effective way to promote change? Yes or no, and why or why not? So, I personally am arguing the side that civil disobedience is definitely an effective way to promote change. And my first reason is because historically, civil disobedience just has a reputation of helping things change for the better, helping things advance, and helping people. So, for example, a lot of people go back to the civil rights movement, obviously. That's the first thing that comes to mind for me, too. So, things like Rosa Parks not getting up from her seat, or the men in Greensboro who didn't get up from the counter. But civil disobedience also goes further back to from times like Gandhi, when he led all the Indian people across India and he picked up the grain of rice, which was an act of civil disobedience because Indian people weren't allowed to grow rice, and peaceful protests like the March on Selma, and all those types of different things that were all acts of civil disobedience because these were things that people weren't allowed to do or weren't supposed to do or were against the law that they did, which all 3 of those things led to change. Obviously, as today you can see, black people are allowed to sit anywhere in the bus, black people are allowed to sit at counters, and Indian people no longer have some of those laws that were set in place that were being fought against. But something I didn't address in my essay is I feel like a really important part of civil disobedience being successful is the nonviolent part. I feel like that's a large part of what all these people followed and a large part of why they were successful because there wasn't violence involved. So my second reason why I believe civil disobedience is an effective way to promote change is because civil disobedience brings a problem directly to authorities. So if you ask me, authorities' main job is to keep the peace. They have many things they're in charge of, but what they need to do is keep the peace. And when people perform acts of civil disobedience, it's not ruining, but going against their flow of peace. And so they're forced to directly address the problem in order for things to not get worse or in order for things to stay in line almost. So civil disobedience forces attention to the problem, and even if it isn't changed directly how you want it to, it forces authorities to, 1, address there's a problem, and 2, do something before it becomes something bigger. And many people would argue that there's other ways to fight for what you believe in, or that civil disobedience can lead violent, because it honestly really can. Even the civil rights movement did have its violence times, but other ways that people would name would be things like protest, or emailing people, or trying to get petitions and things like that, and trying to get people involved. But it's great to have people educated, and I understand that, but petitions at the end of the day, 1, they're an extremely hard process to go through. To get through the first stage, you need to have about 100 signatures within 30 days. And after that stage, second stage, you need to get 100,000 signatures within 30 days. And even though that sounds easy, it's really not. It's really difficult to get people involved in the cause. And then people will say things like emailing, but it's really easy to ignore things like that. And that goes back to the acts of civil disobedience, bring things directly to the authorities. So I think that argument is, although a logical argument, it doesn't really stand to the amount of as big of an effect as civil disobedience does. So at the end of the day, I think many things about civil disobedience make it maybe not the best way, but it's definitely an effective way to promote change. It helps people bring people together. It has worked in our history, as I talked about. It brings things directly to authority, as we talked about. It just has a good past and a good reputation, and I think if it's done correctly, 9 times out of 10 it'll work, and it'll just be the best option. So yeah, that's my side on what civil disobedience is, if it's a good way to promote change, and all of those things. I'm really glad we talked about it in school because, like I said, it opened my eyes to a lot of things that I hadn't thought about before and why things are the way they are. And yeah. So, in conclusion, I think civil disobedience is definitely an effective way to promote change.